Hello everybody. So today we're talking about Introduction to Wilderness Management and what the wilderness is all about and how do we deal with it. So let's get into it. So in terms of wilderness, and let me slide myself out of the way so you can see that clearly, wilderness is one of the most appealing concepts associated with natural resources. People really gravitate towards the idea of wilderness, and it's actually one of the things that makes the United States special when it comes to the idea of natural resources, because there's not a lot of places that just reserved public land the way that we did in this country just overall. But then not only that, but then actually had the idea to make some of that land just wilderness, where it's just left on its own. It's uncontrolled by humans. We give a vision of nature left to evolve under its own influences. And I think there's a lot of people that gravitate towards that. A lot of people that appeals to, the idea of just being able to go to a place and you know that there is nothing there except for the trees, the animals, and just the outdoors. In terms of how much wilderness do we have in the United States? So in the U.S., we've got 803 wilderness areas, which is over 111 million acres in the National Wilderness Preservation System. More than half of that wilderness is in Alaska. No big surprise if you've ever been up to Alaska. All of these areas, all these wilderness areas are roadless, and they are primitive recreation amid solitude. What does that mean? It means when you go up there, you're on your own. You're not going to go find a campground. You're not going to go find a parking lot. You'll find a trailhead, and it'll be marked there. And then after that, whatever happens is kind of up to you. I've got, down here, I've got a wilderness facts that you can pause this video and click on and take a look at, as well as a video from Olympic National Park. So go ahead and look at the notes and pause this video and take a look. So where are the wilderness areas in the U.S.? Well, you can see, and it should be no surprise because of just the amount of public land that we have within the western United States, that the majority of our wilderness areas are in the western United States, or at least our federal wilderness areas. Most of the wilderness areas are usually already attached to national forests or to BLM land, and then it's just a specific part of that area that's designated. For example, the picture that we started off this lecture with was from the Ansel Adams Wilderness, which is within the Inyo National Forest. Same thing, the John Muir Wilderness is within a national forest, and I believe there's wilderness areas within national parks as well. So it just kind of depends. They're kind of mixed in to these areas. And so how does it change then? Well, you could be in the national forest. All of a sudden you get to the wilderness areas and you just won't see the amenities that you might see in the other areas of the national forest. You know, there might be the random bathroom or parking lot or campground, that sort of stuff. Once you get to the wilderness areas, you're on your own, basically. It is you and nature, and a lot of people really just love that idea. In terms of Alaska, we said half of the wilderness areas are up in Alaska, and you can see there's quite a gigantic couple gigantic patches of wilderness areas up in the Brooks Range, up in the northern part of Alaska. But there's also a lot on the islands, the Aleutian Islands, as well as going down the upper part of the Rockies. So how does something become a wilderness area? Well, since 1930, there's been an effort to review remaining roadless areas. People really wanted to keep this idea that they thought of naturalness and solitude, and really trying to keep even the ones, really wanted to make sure that these areas, even if they're within national parks or forests, stay that way. So in 1964, under Lyndon Johnson, we had the Wilderness Act, and the Wilderness Act became the permanent legislation for protection of these wilderness areas. There is a process for selecting them. Wilderness itself is defined as federal lands that were untrammeled and are not subject to human control. So the idea that humans aren't really involved in what happens out there. They are allowed for primitive and unconfined modes of recreation. So basically, things that aren't motorized for the most part is what you can take out there. And initially, in 1964, they started with 54 areas and over 9 million acres. And that 9 million acres in 1964 has grown to over 100 million nowadays. And so here is the process of how it works. So you get state or federal land management agencies or a group of organized citizens, whoever. They're going to recommend an area to become a wilderness. Then you have to get Congress involved. And so you got to get the House of Representatives and the Senate to agree on the same recommendation. So they enact wilderness legislation. It goes to the president. The president will either sign it and agree with it, or they will veto the wilderness bill. And if they sign and agree with it, then you get a wilderness designated. So it seems like it's an easy path, easy amount of steps, but really this one right here, recommending an area to become a wilderness and getting congressional backing behind it, getting the legislation written correctly to where people totally agree with it. You get the people in the House and the people in the Senate to all agree to the same thing and then get it sent to the president. That's a pretty big step with a lot of work and a lot of effort behind it. It can be done, absolutely. Another way that wilderness gets designated is through the Antiquities Act, which we've talked about before, where the president will just go ahead and use his or her power to enact a wilderness area and just designate it. And so, in 2014, we celebrated 50 years of the Wilderness Act, and it's really a big deal for people that there's this idea that they can connect to the past and that they can see things for the way that they are, and not human influence. It's something that for a lot of people is really important. If you want to, once again, pause the video, I've got a couple videos about the Wilderness Act and how it came about, and just what wilderness kind of means to people. So go ahead and pause again. So there are not only are there there's the federal wilderness system, but there are also state wilderness systems as well. There are 7 state wilderness systems as of 2007. There might be more. You got 84 areas totaling 2.9 million acres, with New York, Alaska, and California leading the way. Additionally, 5 states have state designated wilderness systems, which are 275,677 acres. So in terms of California's state wilderness areas, there's 12 areas. And the California Wilderness Act, which established these state wilderness areas, this is the opening part of the California Wilderness Act. In order to assure that an increasing population, accompanied by expanding settlement and growing mechanization, does not occupy and modify all areas on state-owned lands within California, leaving no areas designated for preservation and protection in their natural condition, it is hereby declared to be the policy of the state of California to secure for the present and future generations the benefits of an enduring resource of wilderness. And really the idea, and it's great, in my mind, it's great foresight and great thinking that, we are going to spread out. We are going to dominate all these areas. We are going to, if we can manage to live in it, people are going to live in it. But it was really great foresight to make sure that there's at least some areas that are left on their own and left to be just places where you can go and experience wilderness and experience the world for what it is, without other people and other urbanization and other things going on. If you want to read more about these 12 different California state wildernesses, you can click on this link that I put in here for you. So wilderness protection. So what does wilderness protection mean? What does a wilderness area actually mean? So it's protected from logging roads, from dams, or any other permanent structures being put in them. There's no timber cutting or motor vehicle operation. The timber cutting is meaning that they're not cutting down. They're not doing logging. They're not cutting for timber. We'll talk about it in a couple slides, but they actually do go in there and cut. Like say if the trail's blocked or you get a down tree or some problems, they will go in and do very minimal management. Since 1984, no minerals have been taken off of wilderness areas. Hunting and fishing are permitted in certain wilderness areas. Mining and livestock grazing are grandfathered in to areas, but like we said, there's been no mineral claims since 1984, as well as pre-existing airfields. But they want to minimize the impact on wilderness as much as possible. The boundary lines are drawn to exclude areas with abundant natural resources, because you just don't want to have that problem and eventually have people trying to, poach from these or really take from these wilderness areas. We want them to just be these areas that can stay this way for long periods of time. And then these wilderness areas, they maintain the opportunity for high quality recreational experience from naturalness and solitude. So really the idea of trying to have this opportunity to have a high quality recreational experience where you are out there and it is you and nature, and whatever happens. So what are our principles of wilderness management? So it's a five tiered principle system. Maintain wilderness thresholds. So we just said what makes it a wilderness. So make sure that we are maintaining those thresholds and that we're not having any issues there. Manage wilderness for non-degradation of individual areas. So we really want to make sure that if we're going to manage these areas, if we're going to do anything, we're really focused on the idea of making sure that the area is not degrading away, whether that's through too much use or invasive species or anything that is taking away from the absolute solitude and beauty that the nature of the area should be providing. Manage wilderness as a holistic resource. The idea that when we're looking at wilderness areas, we're looking at wildlife habitat, we're looking at an aesthetic area, we're looking at a recreational resource, we're looking at a place where we're looking for this whole experience. We're not looking for just one thing. It's not just about recreation and having it be pretty. How do we, if we're going to manage this wilderness, how do we actually manage it? And we're thinking about everything involved, though the water, the trees and the grass, the recreational experience, the overall beauty, the wildlife habitat, all of it taken into account all at the same time. We want to favor wilderness dependent activities, right? So we're going to favor things like like people just backpacking and hiking, because that's going to be your biggest that's going to be kind of your biggest source of recreation, and also something that is very wilderness dependent, right? People are really going in there because they want to just be out there on their own, and so that's what you really want to favor. So how would you do that? Or what in management are you looking to do to make sure that you're favoring wilderness dependent activities? Well, let's just think about a trail, because that's a super simple one, right? The majority of trails you're going to find in a wilderness area are going to be little single track trails. What do we mean by single track trails? Well, the idea that, 2 feet can fit on it pretty easily, and not much else. Because why? We're not expecting people to be driving ATVs through there, because you can't, or cars or anything like that, or that sort of thing. We don't need big, huge wide paths. We need just paths that are made just small enough so we know where we're going, but not that we're trying to invite people to do all these other sorts of activities out there. We want it to favor the wilderness-dependent activities. And we want to use the minimal amount of tools possible, and really use primitive tools as well, because we're not trying to urbanize these areas. We're not trying to develop these areas. We're just trying to manage them for what they are supposed to be. And so here's a couple examples of management. So you can see here on the right what we were talking about, the idea of a single track trail. This is the Gallatin National Forest and the wilderness area within that. And you can see just here's a little sign right here, National Forest Wilderness. And if you zoom in on that sign, all it's really talking about is the idea of there's no motorized vehicles, no any sort of vehicles with motors, hang gliders, and something else. I can't even remember what the sign says. But basically, it's very little management in terms of the sign. It's just there's a little sign, there's the trailhead, and that's it. And then here, if you have some problems with some dead trees, or you have a fire go through and you're trying to deal with it, you're going to be using primitive tools. So you're going to be using a crosscut saw like this instead of a chainsaw, because we're trying to keep this area as primitive and undeveloped as we can, and we're not trying to put in big logging roads and get rid of these trees. We're just trying to do as much management as we can to keep the areas open for those wilderness dependent activities, and then that's it. So I think this slide becomes really important in terms of what we're talking about in terms of wilderness management, is the idea of what is natural and what do we consider to be natural. What conditions are we trying to preserve? Because we're really trying to give it's an interesting question of, are we trying to give people a look into the past and what it looked like before people were here and settled all over the place? Or are we really just trying to give people a look at nature running its own course and nature being on its own? A good example of this would be, and I've got some below, but another one that you want to kind of think about is invasive species. So if an invasive species gets into the wilderness area, should we manage it? Or should we let that invasive species take over? Because that is natural, right? That is a species coming into an area and taking over. Now, the argument to that would be, well, yeah, but it was brought there somehow. It doesn't grow in that area. It's not native to that area, so it was somehow brought into that area, and now it's taking over. And so, that's a really good example of this idea of what is natural. What conditions are we trying to preserve? Are we trying to preserve the way that it looks right now, and that's the way we want it to look always? Or are we trying to just keep it in a natural state and whatever happens? So it's a really interesting question. The goal, and the way we're going to label it, is to facilitate the free play of natural forces. Wilderness managers are guardians, not gardeners. That's a good way to think about it. We're not trying to go out there and manicure it and make it look a certain way. We want it to just let the free play of nature go, but we don't want it to go so far that the wilderness becomes a problem and doesn't become usable anymore. So problems that can exist with this idea of natural and wilderness: the exclusion of fire. So in some areas you're going to experience unnatural heavy fuel loading, which we know can be problematic, which can lead to large catastrophic wildfire. And what I think, and hopefully others are on board as well, is that wilderness management should include prescribed fire, because it is a primitive management tool. It's really it's a management technique that really is trying to mimic what would happen in nature anyways, and I think it's a really good solution to the exclusion of fire issue. Sometimes you can get unnatural levels of fish stocking, where you just get your ponds or your lakes or whatever you have are just too overloaded with fish. So what do you do in those cases? Do you just let it let it get figured out? Do you just let fish die? What do you actually do there? And another problem that you can have, continued livestock grazing, because like we mentioned in the slides before, one of the ways that they got people to agree to designate these wilderness areas in the first place was that they could grandfather in some of these areas that get livestock grazed. But then if you start thinking about that, is that natural? Is that the way it would look? Or is that the way it looks because it's actually being managed through basically through range management, through livestock grazing in these wilderness areas? So that's just some things to think about when you're thinking about this idea of, oh, well, it's managing a wilderness area. How hard can it be? Here you go. You put up some signs and then let people go, right? What are you going to do? No, there's some real things you should think about, because it does take some effort to think about what is this picture we're trying to show people? What is wilderness? What is this idea that we want people to see, and this feeling that we want people to get when they come here? One big thing that's really important with this whole idea of wilderness is, and the whole idea of America, and really how wilderness areas play into the lore and culture of America, is the idea that people draw inspiration from these wilderness areas. People draw a feeling of freedom from these wilderness areas. The wilderness areas give them a sense of living that no other place can. And so you have leadership programs like Outward Bound and Knowles, where they take people into the wilderness and they teach people how to lead people in the wilderness, and the confidence and skills gained from that are really useful for people. You got programs like this Anasazi program that I provide you with a link to, where it's trying to get people to change their people who are on a wrong path, trying to change their behavior and change their habits and patterns to really get themselves to turn their lives around and really lead a better life, and actually using the wilderness as therapy for them to be able to adjust back into society. And for a lot of people, going into the wilderness is a reprieve from cultural influences and from prevailing norms. I think my brother, who's a big advocate of wilderness, I think this is his big thing, the liberation from the daily patterns and pressures. He'll go into the wilderness for 3, 5, 7 days, and he goes out there, he backpacks, he goes and sees beautiful places, and maybe sees a person or two the whole time that he's out there, and it's so different from what he does on a normal basis that it's a transformational experience. And I think there's another part of it where the consequences of being out there on your own, and the idea that it's you and nature, and if something happens to you, something happens to you. I think having that feeling really gives people a different sense of freedom, a different sense of belonging, a different sense of their place in the world and in society. And I think it's just there's so many interesting psychological effects that happen with the idea of wilderness. On the right here, I've given you some links to Outward Bound, the Anasazi organization, and the Wilderness Society, who's the professional organization that helps with management and legislation for wilderness areas. And the last thing that I'll leave you with is this quote from Edward Abbey: "Wilderness is not a luxury, but a necessity of the human spirit, as vital to our lives as water and good bread." And the idea of just, something like this, where, here's this single track going up into the mountains, and you can just see off into the distance, and all you see are rocks and trees and grass and no other people, and blue skies. There's just something about that just really appeals to so much of us, especially so much of us who really care and enjoy the beauty of natural resources. And I hope you guys take advantage of wilderness areas, and I hope you guys enjoy wilderness areas, and I hope you guys see the need and necessity for wilderness areas. And then if you want, there's another YouTube video here that I think is really enjoyable, and that's what I'll leave you with. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and hope you get out to a wilderness area sometime soon.